There is a scene television audiences have watched for 50 years without ever fully reckoning with what it actually shows. A small prairie town, built board by board across a decade of Sunday nights, is packed with dynamite by its own residents and blown apart, house by house, so that no one else can ever have it. Children who grew up watching Charles Ingalls tuck his daughters into bed on quiet Wednesday evenings remember this instead. Smoke rising over Walnut Grove, timber falling into dust, a community choosing annihilation over surrender. Most people assume it was simply a dramatic finale. It was not simply anything. It was Michael Landon, the man who built that town in the first place, refusing to let anyone else decide how his story would end. What almost nobody clocked at the time, and what still unsettles longtime fans when they look closely enough, is how precisely that finale foreshadowed the final chapter of Landon's own life. 7 years after Walnut Grove burned on command, Landon would face an ending he did not choose, delivered by a diagnosis rather than a network memo, and he would meet it with the exact same instinct: take control of the narrative before it can be taken from you. The image audiences carry of Michael Landon is warm, indestructible, endlessly patient, the perfect television father. That image is not false. But it was built, deliberately, by a man running from something far less gentle, and the closer you look at how his story actually ends, the harder that wholesome image becomes to hold on to without flinching. This is the story of how a boy who spent his childhood afraid of his own house grew up to build one of the most beloved houses in American television history, and then, with the same hands, tore it down before anyone else could. Before we go further, if you find yourself moved by stories like this one, stories about the people who shaped the living rooms of our childhoods, consider honoring Michael Landon with a like on this video, and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. It costs nothing, and for the families who keep these legacies alive, it means more than you might think. Before there was a Ponderosa or a Walnut Grove, there was a small apartment in Forest Hills, Queens, and a household that offered Michael Landon almost none of the stability he would later manufacture, episode after episode, for millions of strangers. He was born Eugene Maurice Orowitz in 1936, the son of a Jewish theatrical press agent father and a Catholic former showgirl mother, in a home where love existed but rarely arrived without static. His mother struggled with a mental illness that periodically overwhelmed her, and young Eugene absorbed the kind of chaos children are never equipped to metabolize on their own. There were episodes severe enough to frighten a child permanently, moments when a parent's instability became the defining fact of a household rather than a passing weather system. He learned early that safety was not something the adults around him could reliably provide. If he wanted it, he would have to build it himself. School offered no refuge. Eugene was small, self-conscious, and Jewish in a neighborhood where that made him a target, and the bullying he endured there was not incidental cruelty but a sustained campaign that left marks far deeper than the era's casual dismissal of kids being kids ever accounted for. He was mocked for his size, his name, his family, mocked in the specific, surgical way children find when they sense a peer has no one at home to defend him. He internalized the lesson that vulnerability was dangerous, that the world would exploit any weakness it could find, and that the only durable protection was to become someone the world could not touch. He found, almost by accident, a single area where the ridicule stopped: his body. A javelin-throwing talent emerged in high school with startling suddenness, and for the first time, Eugene Orowitz experienced what it felt like to be admired rather than diminished. A javelin scholarship carried him to the University of Southern California, and for a brief window, physical excellence looked like it might be the escape route out of Forest Hills entirely. Then a torn tendon ended that possibility almost as fast as it had appeared, and the young man who had finally found one thing the world could not mock was left, once again, with nothing solid beneath him. What happened next would become the blueprint for the rest of his life. Instead of collapsing into the identity of a boy who kept losing the few footholds he found, he reinvented himself completely. He changed his name to Michael Landon, walked into acting with no formal training and considerable desperation, and began building, from nothing, the version of himself he wished he had been given as a child. Decades later, he would put the rawest version of this period on screen in The Loneliest Runner, a semi-autobiographical film he wrote and directed about a bullied boy who bedwets, is mocked mercilessly for it, and channels his shame into becoming a champion long-distance runner. Landon rarely spoke publicly with total candor about his own childhood. He did not have to. He simply wrote it, disguised as fiction, and let anyone paying close enough attention understand exactly what he had survived. This is the piece that explains everything that came after: the need for control that would define his entire career, the instinct to protect vulnerable young castmates the way no one had protected him, the compulsion to write, direct, and produce nearly every hour of television he touched rather than trust anyone else with the material. Landon was not simply an ambitious man. He was a formerly powerless boy who had decided, with total conviction, that he would never again be powerless in a room that mattered to him. Every set he ever ran would answer to him and only him. Every story he ever told would end exactly the way he intended it to end. It is impossible to understand the finale of Little House on the Prairie, or the way Landon faced his own death 7 years later, without first understanding the child who grew up believing that control was the only form of safety that could not be taken away. The reinvention worked faster than anyone could have predicted. Landon booked small television roles through the mid-1950s, unremarkable parts that nonetheless kept the newly minted actor fed and visible, until 1959 handed him the role that would make Eugene Orewitz's transformation permanent in the eyes of the public. Bonanza cast him as Little Joe Cartwright, the impulsive, hot-tempered youngest son of the Ponderosa Ranch's patriarch, and for 14 seasons Landon became a fixture in American homes on Sunday nights, growing up on screen from a brash young cowboy into a seasoned leading man. Bonanza gave him something far more valuable than fame, though fame arrived in abundance. It gave him a television education few actors of his generation ever received. He watched how episodes were structured from the inside, learned the mechanics of directing by observing rather than studying, and began quietly writing scripts for the show, teaching himself the discipline of turning an idea into 60 finished minutes of television. By the time Bonanza's long run neared its end, Landon was no longer simply an actor waiting for the next role. He had become a self-taught showrunner in everything but title, and he was hungry for a project that would let him prove it. That project arrived in 1974 with Little House on the Prairie, adapted from Laura Ingalls Wilder's autobiographical novels about a pioneer family carving a life out of the unforgiving American frontier. On paper, Landon was cast as Charles Ingalls, the steady, loving father at the center of the Ingalls family. In practice, from nearly the first episode onward, Landon was the show. He wrote a significant majority of its scripts. He directed a significant majority of its episodes. He executive produced the entire run, overseeing budgets, casting, tone, and the countless small decisions that determine whether a television drama feels alive or merely competent. No other performer of his era combined creative authorship and on-camera leading man duties at that scale, week after week, for 9 consecutive seasons. It was an almost unprecedented concentration of control in a single person's hands, and it was entirely by design. The boy who once had no say over the chaos in his own home had grown into a man who would never again let a project he cared about run without his hand on every lever. That control produced something remarkable, a family drama willing to walk directly into subjects most 1970s television avoided entirely. Under Landon's direction, Little House on the Prairie built entire episodes around alcoholism, sexual assault, racial prejudice, blindness, death, and grief, treating each subject with a seriousness that occasionally shocked audiences who had tuned in expecting gentle pioneer nostalgia. Landon was not interested in gentle nostalgia. He was interested in using a wholesome, trusted format to smuggle real emotional truth into homes that might never have accepted that truth delivered any other way. Viewers who had grown up believing television families existed to reassure them instead found themselves confronting the same fears and losses that shaped Landon's own childhood, translated into pioneer clothing and filtered through Charles Ingalls' steady, fatherly voice. The show's emotional honesty was not incidental to its popularity. It was the entire engine of it. But total control has a cost, and the set of Little House on the Prairie paid it in ways that rarely made it into the show's wholesome public image. Landon's demand for perfection was constant, and his authority on set was, by nearly every account from those who worked alongside him, absolute. He expected the same discipline from his cast and crew that he demanded of himself, and those who could not or would not match his pace often found the relationship strained. The most publicly documented friction came with co-star Karen Grassel, who played matriarch Caroline Ingalls. Grassel and Landon clashed over pay disparities between the two leads and over creative decisions Landon made unilaterally as the show's guiding authority, tensions that simmered for years beneath the surface of a series built on the image of a united, loving family. It was, in miniature, the same pattern that defined Landon's entire career. Extraordinary creative output purchased at the price of near-total control. Control that occasionally left the people around him feeling like instruments in someone else's vision rather than full collaborators in a shared one. Yet the same intensity that created friction with adult colleagues produced something closer to devotion among the show's youngest cast members. Melissa Gilbert, who played the Ingalls family's second daughter Laura and grew up almost entirely on the Little House set, would come to describe Landon as far more than a boss or scene partner. He functioned as a genuine mentor to her, a steadying adult presence during a childhood spent almost entirely in front of cameras, offering the kind of consistent attention and encouragement that his own childhood had conspicuously lacked. Dean Butler, who joined the cast as Laura's love interest and eventual husband Almanzo Wilder, and Alison Arngrim, who played the show's memorably antagonistic Nellie Olson, would each later describe Landon in strikingly similar terms. Demanding, yes, exacting, certainly, but also the emotional center of the entire production, the person whose energy set the tone for everyone on set each morning. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He noticed when a young cast member was struggling and made time, amid a schedule that would have exhausted most executive producers twice over, to sit with them and talk it through. It is worth sitting with the contradiction rather than resolving it too quickly. The same man who fought bitterly with a grown colleague over money and authority was, by multiple accounts, an almost paternal figure to the children on his set. Protective in a way that suggests he was giving them something he had never received himself. Control, for Landon, was never really about power for its own sake. It was about making sure the people under his protection, whether that meant a fictional pioneer family or the real children playing them, never experienced the instability he had grown up inside. He could not always extend that same generosity to peers who challenged his authority. But toward the vulnerable, toward the young, his instinct was consistently, almost compulsively, protective. 9 years is an extraordinary run for any television drama, and by the early 1980s, Little House on the Prairie had become something larger than a hit show. It had become a fixture, a Sunday night ritual for millions of families, a program parents trusted enough to let shape their children's understanding of loss, courage, and belonging. Which is exactly what made what happened next so difficult for Landon to accept. The numbers, laid flat, are almost hard to believe for one man across one uninterrupted career. 14 seasons on Bonanza. 431 episodes across that show's run. 9 seasons on Little House on the Prairie. Over 100 episodes, the overwhelming majority written or directed by Landon personally, many of them both. Multiple Golden Globe nominations. A Primetime Emmy nomination for his writing. 5 additional seasons on Highway to Heaven, again as creator, frequent writer, and frequent director. 3 long-running network dramas, back-to-back-to-back, spanning nearly 3 uninterrupted decades, with Landon functioning as a controlling creative force on every single one. Few actors in television history have matched that combination of longevity and hands-on authorship. Fewer still have done it while starring on camera in nearly every episode at the same time. The volume alone explains why cast and crew describe 18-hour days as ordinary. It explains the friction with Karen Grassel over pay and creative control, friction that simmered across years of unequal recognition between 2 leads carrying a hit show. It explains why Melissa Gilbert, a child for most of her run on the series, later needed to specifically credit an adult on set for making a chaotic industry feel survivable. 3 decades. 3 hit shows. One man, writing, directing, producing, and starring, almost without pause, from his 20s into his 50s. The pace itself was a form of control. Slowing down meant leaving space for doubt, and doubt was the one thing Michael Landon had spent his entire adult life refusing to leave room for. By 1982, network attention was drifting. Little House on the Prairie's ratings, while still respectable, no longer commanded the dominant position they once had, and NBC began signaling that the show's time was ending, not through a dramatic announcement but through the quieter, more brutal language networks use when they are done with something. Reduced episode orders, shifted time slots, budget tightening. For most producers, cancellation is something that happens to a show. For Michael Landon, it was closer to an act of violence against something he had spent 9 years building from his own bare hands, and he was not the kind of man who accepted violence passively. What Landon did with that ending is, even decades later, one of the boldest creative decisions in the history of American network television. Rather than simply allowing the series to fade out on a quiet, ordinary episode, he wrote and directed a television movie-length finale titled The Last Farewell, and inside its story he built a metaphor so pointed it barely qualified as subtext. The plot found the fictional town of Walnut Grove threatened by a land developer determined to seize the townspeople's homes through a legal technicality. Rather than surrender the town to someone who had not built it, had not bled for it, had not loved it, the citizens of Walnut Grove chose annihilation instead. They packed the buildings with dynamite. They lit the fuses themselves. And on screen, in front of millions of viewers who had spent 9 years believing they were watching a gentle pioneer drama, an entire town was reduced to rubble by the very people who had built it, rather than let it fall into unworthy hands. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this was as a piece of television storytelling, and it is impossible to separate it from what was actually happening off-screen. NBC had decided Little House on the Prairie's time was over. Landon, rather than accept that decision as final, effectively hijacked his own cancellation and turned it into the most dramatic statement of authorship in the show's entire run. If the network was going to take Walnut Grove away from him, he would make certain there was nothing left to take. The finale was not merely fiction reflecting reality. It was Landon using the full creative authority he had spent 9 years accumulating to answer corporate rejection with total, irreversible destruction, on his own terms, in his own voice, with his own hand on the detonator. Where another producer might have accepted the quiet fade-out networks typically offer aging hits, Landon chose fire. He chose an ending no one could reverse, revise, or reclaim. Watching The Last Farewell today, knowing what would happen to its creator 7 years later, is an almost unbearably different experience than it was for audiences in 1984. At the time, viewers understood it as a satisfying, if unusually intense, send-off for a beloved show, a dramatic bow, tinged with sadness but ultimately an act of closure rather than loss. Landon himself appeared, briefly, in a coda addressing the audience directly, thanking them for 9 years of loyalty, offering the kind of warm, direct gratitude he rarely extended in interviews. It read, at the time, as a graceful goodbye between a storyteller and the audience who had trusted him. It reads differently now. Knowing what was coming, the image of Michael Landon standing amid the wreckage of a town he built and then destroyed, rather than let anyone else claim it, becomes something closer to a rehearsal. He would not have called it that. He likely did not consciously intend it as one. But the instinct on display, take control of the ending before someone or something else can take it from you, was the same instinct that would carry him through the final months of his life. This was Landon's public climax. Not a quiet retirement, not a dwindling ratings slide into cancellation, but a defiant, self-authored inferno that turned an ending imposed on him into an ending he owned completely. For 9 years he had used the show to process private pain in public, gently, episode by episode, issue by issue. In its final act, he stopped being gentle about it. He simply showed the audience, in the most literal terms television allows, exactly how far he was willing to go rather than surrender something he loved to a decision he had no part in making. In the years following Little House on the Prairie, Landon did not slow down in any way that resembled the retirement his industry standing would have easily permitted. He moved almost immediately into Highway to Heaven, a series he created, executive produced, and frequently wrote and directed, built around an angel sent back to Earth to quietly help struggling people find their way through hardship. It was, in its own way, an even more direct expression of the values that had always animated his best work. Kindness as an active force, redemption as something available to anyone willing to reach for it, small human decency treated as worthy of the same dramatic weight as any battle or crisis. For 5 seasons, Landon poured the same obsessive hands-on energy into Highway to Heaven that he had poured into everything before it, control still functioning as his primary mode of care. Then, in April of 1991, the pattern that had defined Michael Landon's entire adult life, meet every threat with total control, refuse every ending that is handed to you rather than chosen by you, collided with something no amount of authority, discipline, or force of will could outproduce. Landon was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and least forgiving diagnoses in modern medicine, discovered only after the disease had already progressed to a stage that left little room for the kind of triumphant recovery narrative television might have scripted for him. This was not a story he could rewrite in the editing room. This was not a network decision he could answer with defiance and a detonator. For the first time in his adult life, Michael Landon was facing an ending that his own will could not restructure into something survivable. What he did instead was, in its own quiet way, every bit as bold as blowing up Walnut Grove. Rather than retreat from public view to manage the diagnosis privately, the way most public figures of his era would have instinctively chosen to do, Landon called a press conference and told the truth. He described his condition plainly, without euphemism, and made clear he intended to fight it with the same intensity he had brought to every set he had ever run. It was, in effect, Landon exercising the only form of control still available to him. He could not control the disease, but he could control how the story of his illness would be told, and he chose openness over concealment, directness over the protective mythology that so often surrounds celebrity illness. The moment that crystallized this choice, and the moment that remains the most emotionally difficult footage of Landon's entire career to watch, came when he appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson for what both men understood, without either needing to say it aloud, was almost certainly his final major public appearance. Carson had interviewed Landon many times before, across decades of easy, warm rapport built between two men who understood television and each other. This appearance was different, and everyone watching knew it was different, and yet Landon walked out and did something almost nobody expects from a man discussing his own terminal diagnosis. He was funny. He was self-deprecating. He talked about his condition with a candor that refused to perform tragedy, refused to let the studio audience's obvious grief dictate the emotional register of the conversation. He made jokes. He made Carson laugh, genuinely, in a way that cut through the somber weight the segment could easily have carried instead. It was not denial. Landon spoke honestly about the seriousness of his diagnosis and the real possibility that he would not survive it. But he refused to let the conversation collapse into pure sorrow, refused to hand the narrative entirely over to grief, insisting instead on humor as a form of dignity, on lightness as its own kind of courage. This was Landon's private climax. The moment the cold open's early promise finally paid off in full. The man who once destroyed an entire fictional town rather than let a network dictate its fate now faced the one ending no amount of creative control could rewrite, and he met it the only way his entire life had trained him to, by refusing to be merely a subject of the story, insisting instead on remaining its author, right up until authorship was no longer physically possible. He did not get the ending he wanted. No amount of will, discipline, or defiance could produce that. But he got, by every account from those who watched that final Tonight Show appearance, exactly the kind of ending he had spent his whole career insisting mattered most. An honest one, delivered on his own terms, with dignity intact and humor still fully alive in his voice. Michael Landon died on July 1, 1991, at the age of 54, less than 3 months after his diagnosis became public. The disease that took him moved with a speed that left little time for the kind of prolonged farewell some public figures are afforded. The public reaction to his announcement was immediate and enormous, tabloids and evening newscasts alike devoting extensive coverage to an actor whose decades of Sunday night presence had made him feel, to millions of households, less like a distant celebrity and more like an actual member of the family. Letters reportedly arrived by the thousands. Strangers who had never met him grieved as though they had. That reaction, disproportionate to almost any other celebrity illness of the era, says less about tabloid appetite than it does about how completely Landon had succeeded, across 3 decades, in convincing an entire generation of viewers that his fictional families were, in some essential way, their own. What time remained, he spent choosing openness over silence, humor over performance, and honesty over the comfortable fictions that fame so often permits. It was, in the end, the same instinct that had guided him since childhood. Rather than let circumstance define the terms of his story, define them himself, for as long as it remained possible to do so. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this one, to let the ending overwhelm everything that came before it, to let a 54-year-old man's death from an unforgiving disease become the single note the entire narrative resolves into. That temptation deserves to be resisted, because it misunderstands what Michael Landon actually spent his career building. The decline was real. The loss was real, and it arrived far too early for a man who still had, by every account of those closest to him, so much storytelling left in him. But the frame that fits his life more honestly is not tragedy alone. It is dignity, chosen and maintained, right up to the final available moment. Consider what Landon actually left behind, beyond the raw fact of an early death. He left Bonanza, which introduced a young, unformed actor to the mechanics of television storytelling and turned him, over 14 years, into someone capable of running an entire production by himself. He left Little House on the Prairie, 9 seasons and well over 100 episodes that took a wholesome pioneer format and used it to smuggle real conversations about grief, addiction, disability, and prejudice into homes that might never have accepted those conversations delivered any other way. He left Highway to Heaven, an entire series built around the radical idea that ordinary kindness deserves the same dramatic weight television usually reserves for battles and crimes. And he left The Loneliest Runner, the one project where he finally, if only in the disguised language of fiction, told audiences exactly what his own childhood had cost him, and exactly what it had taught him about turning shame into purpose. Across all of it runs the same thread. A man who had once been powerless in his own home built an entire body of work premised on the idea that pain, honestly examined, can become a form of connection rather than isolation. Melissa Gilbert, Dean Butler, and Alison Arngrim did not simply work for Michael Landon. They were, by their own later accounts, shaped by him, during years when a controlling, demanding, occasionally difficult man also happened to be the most emotionally present adult in their working lives. That contradiction, difficult and devoted, controlling and protective, wounded and generous, is not a flaw in his story. It is the story. Few public figures allow both halves of that contradiction to remain visible. Landon's work, almost accidentally, preserved both. What makes his final months resonate so strongly with audiences now, decades later, is not simply that a beloved actor died too young. It is that he died the way he had always insisted his character should live, honestly, with humor intact, refusing to let hardship have the last word even when hardship had, undeniably, won the larger battle. Charles Ingalls, the character Landon spent 9 years writing and playing, was never a man who pretended difficult things were easy. He was a man who faced difficult things directly, told the people he loved the truth about them, and found some form of grace on the other side regardless of the outcome. In his final months, Michael Landon did not merely play that character anymore. He became a real-world example of exactly what he had spent a career trying to teach. That is the present-day relevance this story still carries, decades removed from Walnut Grove's fictional destruction and Landon's real one. In an era saturated with curated, filtered versions of both success and struggle, there is something genuinely rare about a public figure who chose, at the moment he had the least reason to perform anything for anyone, to remain exactly as direct and exactly as human as he had always tried to be on screen. He did not manage his diagnosis into a triumphant comeback narrative, because pancreatic cancer rarely allows one. He did not retreat into silence, because silence had never been his instinct. He simply told the truth, kept his sense of humor, and let the ending be his own, right up until the disease finally took the pen out of his hands entirely. There is one more thread worth pulling before the story closes, because it may be the quietest and most telling one of all. Landon did not simply write fictional fathers for a living. Across his own life, spanning multiple marriages, he raised a large family of his own, and by the recollections of those closest to him, he approached real fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to Charles Ingalls, determined that his own children would never inherit the instability that had defined his boyhood in Forest Hills. It is not difficult to see Little House on the Prairie, and Charles Ingalls specifically, as Landon's attempt to give an entire generation of television viewers the steady, attentive father he wished he had been given himself, while simultaneously trying, in his actual home, to be exactly that father in real life. Fiction and biography blurred constantly in his work, and nowhere more than here. Every time Charles Ingalls sat on the edge of a bed and told one of his daughters the truth about something difficult, gently but without flinching, Landon was rehearsing, in front of millions of strangers, the version of fatherhood he had spent his own childhood without. That is part of why this story continues to resonate so strongly with viewers now old enough to be fathers, grandfathers, or simply old enough to have buried their own parents and begun measuring their own mortality against Landon's. He was not performing an abstract ideal of fatherhood from a safe emotional distance. He was building it, scene by scene, out of the exact absence he had lived through as a child, and then, in his final months, modeling the same honesty toward his own children and castmates that he had spent a career writing into fiction. The lesson those closest to him took from watching him face his diagnosis was not a lesson about bravery in the abstract. It was a far more specific one, that the way you tell the people you love the truth, especially the hardest truths, is itself a lasting inheritance, one that outlives the person delivering it. Go back now to that image from the beginning. A fictional town, built by a real man's own hands, packed with dynamite and detonated by the very people who loved it most, rather than surrendered to anyone unworthy of it. At the time, audiences understood it as spectacle, a bold and unusual way to close out a beloved series. Understood alongside everything that came after, it becomes something closer to a rehearsal for the only ending Michael Landon could not ultimately prevent, but absolutely refused to let anyone else write for him. That is, in the end, what makes this story land so differently for viewers who grew up with him than it might for someone encountering Charles Ingalls for the first time today. It is easy, watching old reruns, to see only warmth, a steady father, a gentle voice, a resolved conflict every 45 minutes. It takes a closer look, the kind this video has tried to offer, to see the boy underneath all of it, the one who never stopped working to make sure no one could ever again take away something that mattered to him without a fight. This is not simply the story of a talented actor who died before his time, though that alone would be reason enough for grief. It is the story of a boy who spent his earliest years learning that the world could take almost anything from him without warning, and who spent every year after that making certain nothing important was ever taken from him again without a fight. He fought for control of his own name, choosing Michael Landon over the identity that had absorbed years of ridicule. He fought for control of his own stories, refusing to hand Little House on the Prairie's most delicate subjects to writers who might soften them into something safer and less true. He fought, at the very end, for control of the only thing left available to him, the tone, the honesty, and the humor with which he would meet a diagnosis that offered him almost nothing else to hold on to. Watching his story now, decades after both the fictional destruction of Walnut Grove and the real one that followed it, it becomes difficult not to think about the endings each of us will eventually face ourselves, whether they arrive announced or not, whether we are given time to prepare for them or not. Landon's example does not promise anyone control over the outcome. Cancer did not negotiate with him any more than it negotiates with anyone else, and it would be a disservice to his memory to pretend his final months were simply triumphant rather than genuinely difficult, genuinely painful, and genuinely too short. But his example does suggest something worth sitting with, that even when the outcome itself cannot be controlled, the way we choose to meet it, honestly or evasively, with humor or with silence, present with the people we love or hidden away from them, remains, until the very last moment, entirely our own to decide. So here is the question worth carrying away from this one, more than any single fact about ratings or Emmy nominations or box office numbers ever could be. If you were given Michael Landon's diagnosis tomorrow, what would you want the people who love you to remember about how you chose to meet it? Would you want to be remembered for the fear, understandable as it would be? Or would you want to be remembered the way Landon is remembered by the people who actually sat across from him in those final months? As someone who kept telling the truth, kept finding the joke, and refused, right up until the end, to let anything take the pen out of his hands before he was ready to set it down. If this story moved you the way it moved us to research and tell it, we'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Not just a reaction. Tell us the specific memory. Where were you the first time you watched Charles Ingalls carry one of his daughters home? What Michael Landon moment has actually stayed with you, all these years later? Share it below. It matters more than you might expect, both to us and to the people reading through the comments who may be remembering him for the very first time.